Good morning. Welcome, and thank you for participating in our workshop. Our presentation takes about an hour, and then we're here for another 45 minutes to receive and answer emailed questions and to listen to stakeholder feedback. Please feel free to email your questions and your comments at any time. Another slide will show you how to email these questions. I'm Mary Boyd. I'm the Senior Engineer with the State Water Board in the Municipal Stormwater Unit. And next, I'd like to introduce our staff who are helping with this workshop. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. We have staff from the Municipal Stormwater Unit and from the Office of Public Participation. Together, we are presenters and we are working behind the scenes. I'd like to introduce staff. When I call their names, I'll ask staff to unmute and introduce themselves. We'll start with Municipal Stormwater Unit. Paul, please unmute.
This is Paul Levy. I'm an environmental scientist in the Municipal Stormwater Unit, and I'm leading the Phase 2 reissuance effort.
Jaime.
Hello, this is Jaime Favila. I'm an environmental scientist in the Municipal Stormwater Unit, and I implement the trash implementation program.
Kyle.
Hi, I'm Kyle McNeil, and I'm a scientific aide in the Municipal Stormwater Unit. I provide assistance on the Phase 2 MS4 permit.
Sheena.
Hi, this is Sheena Dillon, Water Resource Control Engineer in the Municipal Stormwater Unit. I am helping out with today's stakeholder meetings.
Jenny.
Hi, this is Jenny Chen. I'm at the Division Water Quality. I'm working at the Municipal Stormwater Unit, and I'm helping out for this workshop.
Rachel.
Hi, my name is Rachel Del Porto. I'm an engineering aide in the Division of Water Quality, helping with technical support.
And for our Office of Public Participation, today we have Haiti.
Good morning, I'm Haiti Yanamine. I'm with the Office of Public Participation.
Thank you, Haiti. So thank you, staff. Next, I'd like to introduce our workshop facilitator, Diana Messina. Diana is our Chief Engineer for Surface Water Permitting. Diana, take it away. Next slide, please.
Yes, thank you. Next slide, please. Thank you. I'm sorry, previous slide, please. Thank you. Yes, welcome to our stakeholder workshop that Mary's staff is conducting during the development of the proposed statewide NPDES Phase 2 permit for municipal stormwater discharges from small communities. My name is Diana Messina, and I am your facilitator for today. We want to thank you for joining us during this time period when the State Water Board continues its work through remote communications. This is our third workshop out of 4 workshops. These workshops were previously scheduled to take place prior to the shelter-in-place order. Mary and her staff were going to travel throughout the state to discuss issues that pertain to various regions throughout the state. That is why the 4 workshops were specifically labeled as Northern California, Central California, Southern California, and specifically 1 workshop, which is this morning's workshop for the Los Angeles region. The staff presentations for all 4 workshops are the same. However, during this morning's workshop, we're focusing discussion from your comments and questions received to capture issues more prominent to regional stormwater management work currently being implemented in the Los Angeles Regional Board jurisdiction through watershed management plans and enhanced watershed management plans. Before we start, as staff, we'd like to acknowledge our native lands. And so today we are hosting this meeting virtually from our headquarters in Sacramento. As State Water Board staff, we acknowledge the traditional territory and homelands of the Maidu, Miwok, and Nisenan people in the modern city of Sacramento. We know that they are still actively working to stabilize their livelihoods and preserve their way of life. We equally honor the groups who have experienced economic, environmental, and social disadvantages as a result of historic marginalization. We know that we are meeting during a very challenging time, and we recognize the impact this global pandemic has had and will have on communities across California. Thank you. Next slide, please. As staff, we're doing our best to make sure that everyone can participate in an effective way and that this time is valuable to you. Here are some guidelines and logistics for our meeting. First of all, this workshop is being recorded and webcast. As participants, we have provided an email address for you to provide your comments and questions. This is informal discussion. Staff will not be providing written responses to questions or comments, and there will be no formal actions taken from the discussion today. We welcome all comments, including comments on disagreements from anything we have to say. Questions will be answered to the best of our ability. We will be taking a break this morning from 10:15 to 10:30. During that break, it will give you as participants time to provide us questions and comments that may have popped up during our staff presentation or that you have been holding until your time to provide us with that information. If you would like to stay connected and involved in this process for the forthcoming proposed reissuance of the statewide permit, please consider signing up for the LIRIS email subscription for further updates. You can sign up on the State Water Board website. Next slide, please. So the purpose of today's workshop is for staff to share information which is under consideration for the forthcoming statewide permit reissuance. During our staff presentation, we will explain the permit development and State Water Board consideration of adoption process, and we will highlight the different areas and time period in which stakeholders and interested parties like you do have the opportunity to provide further feedback. We will also present the changes to the existing statewide permits which staff is considering. And this includes regulatory permit updates that have taken effect since the adoption of the existing permit, which was adopted back in 2013. We'll also be presenting some regulatory options that we would like you to consider, in which we are also considering for school districts and community colleges. This is one area we truly would like to hear your comments and feedback. And lastly, but not least, is the implementation of the statewide trash provisions, which are currently in effect. So that's the implementation of those trash provisions through the upcoming permit reissuance. As I stated, we will be taking a 15-minute break, and then we are putting on our listening ears to your comments, and we will answer your questions to the best of our ability. Next slide, please. On this slide, we're providing the step-by-step instructions for how to submit questions and comments, and which we will address after our break. So please email your questions and comments at this email address, DWQ, which stands for the Division of Water Quality, phase 2 MS4 workshop at waterboards.ca.gov. Please provide a subject line that says small MS4 workshop number 3, since this is the 3rd workshop. And please provide your name, your agency or organization's location, who you represent, and your comments and questions. If you're having any technical difficulties, we have Rachel available on the other end of this email address, and she will provide you assistance immediately. Please make sure on a technical assistance email in your subject line, you note technical assistance. With that, I'm going to turn the presentation over to Kyle McNeil. Next slide, please, and Kyle, take it away.
Thank you, Diana. So I'd like to give a brief background on the permit and also our stormwater regulatory history. So what is an NPDES permit? NPDES stands for National Pollutant Discharge Elimination System. And this system was authorized by the Federal Clean Water Act. And it was enacted in order to protect water quality, to maintain beneficial uses such as fishing, swimming, drinking, other enjoyable recreational uses, just any beneficial use for the public. And under the NPDES permit, it provides an authorization to discharge to waters of the United States. And these permits are valid for 5 years or until the permit is reissued. Next slide, please. So what is an MS4? An MS4 stands for Municipal Separate Storm Sewer System, which is a system of conveyances owned / operated by a public entity and designed / used for collecting or conveying stormwater. And so an MS4 can be something like a street gutter or storm drains that you see, or it can also be a county road with a ditch on the side of the road with water flowing through it. So an MS4 covers a lot. And there are 2 types of MS4 permittees. We have traditional and non-traditional. Traditional is probably the permittees you'd consider like a municipality or a county. And then non-traditional covers those that are less common, like federal prisons or hospital complexes, military bases, universities, community colleges, fairgrounds. And so because these may have different setups or purposes than like a municipality, they have somewhat different requirements as well. Next slide, please. So here's a bird's eye view of stormwater regulatory history. Back in 1972, the Federal Clean Water Act was established. And then in 1987, stormwater regulation was identified as an important source of water quality regulation under the NPDES program. 3 years later, phase 1 MS4 regulations began, targeting the largest entities, medium and large MS4s. Later in that decade, 1999, phase 2 MS4 regulations were enacted, increasing the scope of entities for stormwater regulation to include small MS4s. Then in 2003, the state of California adopted the phase 2 MS4 statewide general permit, which gave a permit that was more specific focus to California in response to the federal regulations. In 2013, this permit, the phase 2 MS4 statewide general permit, was readopted and expanded to have greater details. So this 2013 permit is our existing permit. And then in 2017, this permit, the statewide general permit, was amended to include total maximum daily loads, TMDLs, and also trash plan informational orders were issued. The trash provisions will be talked about in greater detail by my colleague Jaime Favila later in this presentation. Currently, we're in the year 2020, and we're holding these workshops to get your feedback. And hopefully by the end of next year, 2021, we're hoping that the proposed phase 2 MS4 statewide general permit reissuance may be adopted. Next slide, please. So where are we in the permit development process? We started school outreach and workshops with stakeholders back in 2018. For the past year, State Board staff has been drafting a new permit based on our feedback. Today, we're having preliminary stakeholder workshops. And this timetable is what we anticipate presently, but please keep in mind that this schedule is still evolving based on your feedback at each of the steps. Workshops, public hearings, and drafts may be added depending on your concerns, and that may elongate our timetable. So currently we're planning to, after these workshops, incorporate your feedback into the permit, and then hopefully by late this year, release a permit draft and begin the 45-day public comment period. After that point, a public hearing will be held before the State Water Board, so they'll be informed on the issue, and then another State Board hearing will take place considering the adoption of the proposed permit. And if the State Board does choose to adopt the permit, then the permit reissuance will then go into effect. So that's it for the brief background. And I'm going to turn this presentation over to my colleague, Paul Levy, who is the lead on this. Next slide.
Thanks, Kyle. So I'm going to give an overview of the changes that we've been considering to the existing permit, things we're thinking about moving forward with the reissuance. So first of all, we're definitely trying to do some reorganization and clarification to the permit. We'll be adding in the things for completing the trash provisions. We're considering including public schools and community colleges, and there's a couple phase-in options we're thinking about and some other incentives that we've been thinking about to get these school districts and colleges to partner with local municipalities. We're also looking at some expanded integrated pest management measures, as well as expanded industrial and commercial facility inspections. And then there are some changes we've also been considering for the post-construction section, including possible allowance for offsite compliance and clarifications to some of the regulated project exceptions and clarifications to that definition in general. So for reformatting and reorganizing, this is just kind of a quick example of what I mean by that. And it's not important that you can read what the text actually says. I'm just trying to show in general, on the left side, we have a section from the existing permit. And then on the right side, we have that same section sort of reorganized in the way we're thinking for the upcoming permit. And I guess I'll also say that even the exact numbering scheme is not necessarily finalized, but just in general, we're trying to take these big paragraphs that could have 2 or 3 different provisions in them and to break those out into more singular citable provisions, so it's easier to, cite exactly which part of the permit you're talking about, and break out long lists to make them easier to read. You can kind of see that at the bottom of the right-hand side there. We try to break that list out so that you can actually see how many items are in it and what they are. Another thing is that the existing permit has this task description and implementation level organizational scheme, and we found that to be sometimes confusing or misleading. Task description sound like it doesn't actually have any requirements or provisions in there, but sometimes there are actually important things in the description, and so instead of giving them these titles that are possibly misleading, we just want to turn those all into provisions. So now I'm going to give a really brief overview of the 6 minimum control measures. If you're already a Phase 2 permittee, you're probably very familiar with these, but basically the whole permit is based around them, and I'm going to go through each one and talk about changes we're considering for each section. So there's illicit discharge detection and elimination, which has to do with making sure that only stormwater is entering your stormwater system. Then there's pollution prevention and good housekeeping, which has to do with making sure that your facilities and your operations and maintenance are not exposing anything to stormwater, which could put pollutants into the storm drain, and keeping everything in good order. Then construction site runoff control has to do with making sure that anytime the soil is being exposed and is more erodible while construction is going on within your jurisdiction, that there are things being implemented to reduce the erosion and runoff from that. Then post-construction stormwater management has to do with improving your stormwater controls moving forward as new buildings are built or as buildings are remodeled, and making sure that there are structural controls in place to improve the quality of the stormwater and control the quantity of stormwater runoff. Then there are the public education and outreach section, which has to do with informing the public about the impacts that they can have on local stormwater and how that can then impact local water bodies. And then public involvement and participation, which has to do with making sure your program is fully transparent and open to the public, and that information about your program is publicly accessible, and that you're also making an effort to involve the public, doing river cleanups or things like that, and getting them involved in your program. So changes we're considering for the public education and outreach section, and actually also the public participation and involvement section, is possibly combining these into one. In the existing permit, the public participation and involvement section is pretty short and only actually has a few provisions in it. And really, it's kind of all seems like they're on one large spectrum of basically public education and involvement. And so it made sense to us to kind of just make this a subsection with the public education and outreach section. We're also thinking of moving the staff training requirements into their respective sections. So for example, staff training on illicit discharge detection would be under the illicit discharge section, and staff training on good housekeeping would go under the good housekeeping section instead of being mixed in with the public education requirements. Under illicit discharge detection and elimination, some of the changes we're considering include an expanded industrial and commercial inspection requirement. And what we're thinking here is not necessarily the same scale of inspections that phase ones have to do. I know that that's a pretty tough requirement for some of them to meet, but we're trying to think of ways that these could be worked into existing inspections, such as fats, oils, and grease inspections, CUPA, that's C-U-P-A. I'm forgetting what the acronym stands for, but it's hazardous materials assessments that cities have to do. So CUPA is the Certified Unified Agency. And then also different pre-treatment inspections that some places have to do before they discharge to the wastewater treatment plants. So those are the kind of inspections we're thinking maybe there's a way to add a stormwater element into that, so it's not an additional inspection that has to happen, but just inspections that are already going on can also do these quick checks for signs of illicit discharges or just proper stormwater procedures. Another change in this section is we're trying to simplify the sampling requirements. So the way the existing permit reads, it makes it sound as if anytime you see a dry weather flow coming out of your storm drain, that you need to sample that for this suite of constituents and then compare that to a table of action levels. But I think what that really means is that if you can't identify and stop the discharge, then you need to sample it. So if you can trace, if you can visually trace or just through other means figure out where the discharge is coming from and you can stop that discharge, then there's no need to sample it if you can find out where it's from. Sampling is only necessary when you've really taken every other avenue available and you really can't figure out what what this discharge is, or if it's, you know, hazardous or not. And then we're also thinking about moving the those tables of analytes to test for and levels to compare them to, either into the fact sheet or just referencing a guidance document instead of having them there, kind of breaking up the flow of the permit. Another change we're considering in this section is combining the spill response and illicit discharge response plan. So we kind of felt like right now those are two separate provisions, but a spill and an illicit discharge can be on one, you know, on the same spectrum of things that you would find in your storm drain. So at what point does an illicit discharge become a spill, and at what point do you contact one agency for cleanup versus another? It seemed like it made sense to have those provisions all in one place. And we've seen examples of some permittees that have already combined these plans into one. So I guess I also will point out that we're not thinking, you know, that you have to go through the administrative burden of combining two separate plans into one if you haven't already, but just for the sake of explaining what the requirement is, we thought it made sense to combine this into one requirement. So you can still meet it, I think, by having, you know, two separate paper documents as long as they meet all the requirements that we list in the section. For pollution prevention and good housekeeping, we've definitely discussed asset management, since that's been a hot topic in stormwater permitting lately, and several of recent phase 1 permits have adopted asset management. And I'll just say right away that we're not considering proposing the same level of asset management that some of the phase 1s do. We know that the phase 2s cover a wide range of sizes of cities, and even, you know, all the non-traditionals that aren't cities, and that asset management might not fit everyone in the permit, and it could be a pretty heavy lift to get one of these sophisticated systems going. But what we are thinking of doing is reorganizing several requirements that are already in the permit under one sort of asset management umbrella, since there are a couple different parts that already require you to map out things in your system, such as the stormwater outfalls, and there are a couple inventories that are required. For example, I think the existing permit says you have to prioritize your different parts of your system for clean out. And so we're thinking if we kind of organize all those into one spot, then that's sort of maybe setting up for asset management down the road if that ever becomes more feasible. And just organizationally, it'll be nice to know everything in the permit that needs to be mapped out or inventoried will be in one spot, so you can kind of have one master map of everything potentially. We're also thinking about expanding some of the integrated pest management requirements. So the permit already has some of these, but in anticipation of statewide pesticide provisions and amendments to the statewide water quality plans that have been in the works for a while, we've been thinking about a couple of additional provisions, possibly more monitoring of pest populations before pesticides are used, and you know, just making sure that you're documenting that pesticides are used as the last resort. The Salinas Phase 1 permit recently added some of these provisions, and if you want to take a look at the kind of what we're mulling over, you might check the Salinas permit, because the example permit language that some of the people working on the statewide pesticide amendments provided us to think about was pretty similar to what's in the Salinas permit. So we are thinking over some provisions similar to those. For the post-construction section, we are trying to make some major clarifications to the definition of regulated projects. So in the permit, a regulated project is anything that actually triggers structural low impact design and bioretention best management practices to be installed. And right now, that part of the section, that part of the permit is kind of confusing and maybe doesn't flow as well as it could. So we're definitely trying to organize that a little better and clean up some of those definitions. We're also thinking about making changes and maybe some clarifications to exceptions to these types of projects. So one example is single-family homes. So single-family homes are excluded from the definition of regulated project. However, there's another type of project in the permit called a small project, which has to put in fewer best management practices, but still does have regulations on it. And single-family homes aren't excluded from that, which means that single-family homes affecting between 2,500 and 5,000 square feet would have requirements, but that homes over 5,000 square feet wouldn't have any requirements. And we weren't sure why. We thought that it might make sense to consider also putting requirements on these larger homes too, instead of only the middle-size home projects. We're also trying to clarify the definition of routine road maintenance. So that's a question that comes up a lot when municipalities are considering doing some road maintenance, and they're not sure if that's actually going to trigger a structural control to need to be put in place or not. And so we're trying to kind of sync this up a little better with the definition in the Caltrans permit, and kind of make it more clear that if the road prism or the hydrography of the road is being changed, then that usually means it's not routine. And if you're going in there and changing the sub base of the road, then that usually means it's not routine. Another thing related to that is that we've found that sometimes there are these private projects going in. For example, a project proponent wants to build a new building, and the city says, well, in order to build that building, we also want you to fix the sidewalk in front of it and also the road in front of it. And some of these projects have tried to separate that sidewalk and road work out. So then they end up being smaller projects that don't require any stormwater controls. And we want to make it clear that, well, in what cases that's okay and not okay. So we really think that all of that should be included as one project if the main project isn't going to get approved without the sidewalk or road improvements. And I guess this sort of relates back to one thing about the Phase 2 permit is that we don't require a lot of retrofitting. It's really a permit that tries to improve the stormwater controls moving forward. And so every time something like the road or the sidewalk is getting, fixed up and not getting any stormwater controls put in place with it, it's kind of a lost opportunity until, you don't know when the next time that road or sidewalk is ever going to get the opportunity to have stormwater controls put on it again, and we're not going to, usually require retrofitting there. We're also considering some new allowances for offsite compliance. So, for example, you would still have to maximize the on-site water quality and quantity controls on your project, but then you could make up for any amount of the criteria that you're missing with an offsite project in the same watershed that gives similar or gives equal or more benefits. You also might have the option to participate in a regional project, and basically everyone participating in the project would just pay in-lieu fees to for their sort of portion of the water benefits that they're making up for. And we kind of based this language, or we're kind of looking at the language that's in the San Francisco Regional Board's municipal regional permit that has similar offsite allowances, and that's the type of language that we're kind of looking at and considering right now. Now I'm going to discuss the requirements that we've been considering for schools. And again, these are based on the 6 minimum control measures I touched on earlier. And again, I'm going to go through each control measure and try to describe what we're thinking that will mean for schools. I'm also going to discuss some of the incentives we're considering for schools to participate in regional stormwater projects and coordinate with their local municipalities. But I guess I should also say we're trying to figure out how much room we have to alter these minimum control measures. The federal regulations do kind of set them out as the minimum measures that any one that's designated as a regulated Phase 2 entity will have to do. And so there is some room to kind of alter them as part of these incentives, but we're trying to figure out exactly how much room there is there. One other thing I want to point out is that there are potentially a daunting list of requirements here, but these don't all have to be done immediately. And in fact, they really, each one of these has some build-up time over the 5-year permit term. So, you know, usually in year 1 and 2 of the permit, there are some planning steps that lead up to implementation in years 3, 4, and 5. So it's not really until the final year of the permit that all of this stuff is really up and running and that your full stormwater program is online. I just know that build-up time is one thing that schools have expressed concern about in the past. So what would it mean for a school to have an illicit discharge detection and elimination program? Obviously, it wouldn't be at the same level of a city. I mean, we're assuming schools and school district buildings will have a much simpler storm drain system, but at a basic level, anyone who's a Phase 2 permittee needs to develop a map of their stormwater system and identify where they're discharging to, whether that's to a water body like a river, lake, or the ocean, or whether it's to another MS4 such as the city or county. Then the school district will have to use whatever kind of authority they have available to prohibit illicit discharges. So that means having rules in place that say only stormwater is allowed to go in the storm drain. Anything else going in there is, you know, pollution and really isn't allowed besides a few specific exceptions. And then you're going to need to have some procedures for what to do when there is a spill or illicit discharge in your system. For example, making sure you know who to notify if there's other MS4s downstream of you, in case there is a spill that gets from your system into their system. And then at least at a very basic level, there needs to be some public education about illicit discharges to the public. So that's anyone kind of entering your school grounds or school district property. But that could mean something as simple as stenciling your storm drains and warning that, you know, they actually discharge to a local creek or a river. You know, most of you have probably seen some of those storm drains that have the little picture of the fish on it. So something like that could help meet that requirement. And pollution prevention and good housekeeping for schools would mean basically reviewing campus operations and maintenance activities and making sure that none of those are contributing to stormwater pollution and possibly altering them to, you know, keep pollutants out of the storm drain. And one example is, I know a lot of schools have outdoor lunch areas, and sometimes I've heard that those are cleaned off by just kind of spraying them down. And so sometimes that means trash and food might go into the storm drain system. And so that's an example of one, you know, operation practice that might need to be altered somewhat to avoid putting things into the storm drain. And then similarly, you'd also have to assess different facilities on campus that could generate stormwater pollution. So vehicle maintenance areas, wood shops, and agricultural facilities. And basically identify anywhere where there's, you know, materials or chemicals being stored outside, or where things could be coming out of a, you know, door where the wood shop is open, and maybe that's kind of exposing some leftover waste from the wood shop to rainwater. And you'll just have to put some things in place to kind of preventative measures to make sure that none of those are contributing to stormwater pollution. And I should also point out while I'm saying this that this wouldn't get the school out of any areas that they have that are required to be in the industrial permit. The industrial general stormwater permit sort of has requirements above and beyond this. This is for areas that maybe don't rise to the level of being in the industrial permit, and are definitely not going to require the same level of things that are done to make sure that the industrial permit areas are up to compliance. This will be a smaller requirement than that. And then I'm not sure if this will actually be under this heading in the permit or not, but it kind of goes along with the last two items I mentioned. You'll have to assess areas on campus that generate trash, and you'll have to implement trash control measures, whether that means putting in full capture devices or implementing some other practices to prevent trash from being discharged from your system. And Jaime Favila is going to talk about that a little bit later in the presentation, so I'm not going to go too much more into that here. So for construction site runoff control for schools, that would basically just mean complying with the statewide construction general permit for stormwater. It's something that schools should already be doing, so it won't really be a new requirement, but and that would cover that aspect of the 6 minimum control measures. Now, for post-construction, that may actually have some new things in it. So this would require that new buildings and outdoor areas that are remodeled or reconstructed would have to implement low impact development features. We are hoping this is going to help you sync up with local ordinances. So right now, since schools don't need local building permits, they might be in a city that has some of these stormwater building codes already. But since the school doesn't have to get the local building permit, then that sort of leaves a gap in the coverage of these local codes that are trying to improve stormwater. So we are, hoping that having some of these post-construction requirements on schools would basically finish the coverage of some of those urban areas and not leave gaps in the stormwater coverage. For public education and outreach, schools have expressed concern about the stormwater permit forcing them to change their curriculum or take away their classroom time. And we're not planning on making specific requirements for stormwater to be forced into the classroom or to change the curriculum. We know that there's already kind of a complicated set of requirements and regulations for that. But however, what we do plan on doing is laying out some probably basic stormwater information and messages that you'll need to convey to the public, which basically means everyone coming onto your school district grounds. I mean, staff, teachers, visitors, students. So the public could mean any of those. And it doesn't, the permit will lay out some messages that you'll need to get across, but the way that you convey those messages, there are a couple different options on that, and it doesn't necessarily mean in the classroom. Public involvement and participation for schools, that will also be kind of a smaller aspect of these 6 minimum control measures. It's basically just going to mean making sure that you're being transparent in any time you're developing part of this stormwater program. So if you're having like a school board meeting to decide on how certain aspects of this will be implemented, you just need to make sure that the public is invited and that it's noticed, and that there's just information regarding what's going on with your stormwater program that's available to the public, for example, on your school website. And then, like all other permittees, you'll have to do some reporting. So we have annual reports which have to be submitted on our stormwater reporting website, where you'll document the activities that you did that year and how they were meeting the permit requirements. So the requirements that I all just described now are what the school would have to do basically if they're just working by themselves, not working with any of the local municipalities or other MS4s. They'd basically have to do all of those things. So we're also thinking of incentives to try to get these schools to coordinate with other nearby MS4s. And so that's what I'm going to discuss on this slide. So this list of options, you can see option number 1, which says no stormwater capture on school land. That means you'd have to comply with all the things I just described. Then option number 2, school only stormwater capture of the 85th percentile 24-hour storms. This is still the school kind of just working on their own, not necessarily signing any agreements with other MS4s, but this is sort of a retrofit option we're thinking about providing. If the school is willing to do some stormwater capture of their own stormwater that's falling on school grounds and on school district property, then we think that that could lead to reduced permit fees and possibly, where we can, minimizing some of those measures that I just described and maybe making them a little bit easier to do in some ways. And then option 3 and 4 have to do with signing an agreement with another MS4 and basically allowing some of the city or county's stormwater to come into school property and to be basically captured and stored and either infiltrated or used by some facilities that could be installed on the school, such as an underground capture vault or something like that. So under both of those options, you would have, again, a reduced permit fees or possibly no permit fees and an easier set of minimum control measures to meet. So, and additionally, if you are signing an agreement with the local MS4, there are also certain parts of those minimum control measures that they might be able to, help you achieve or report. They might be able to do some of the reporting for you. So working with the local other MS4s could definitely ease the burden of some of their requirements. And so what we're really trying to get at here is getting the schools to participate, especially in some of these phase 1 areas where these watershed management plans and enhanced watershed management plans exist. We really are trying to get the schools to participate in those. So on this slide, I'm going to discuss the different options that we're considering for both criteria for deciding which school districts to enroll. So we're not planning on enrolling every single school district in the state. For one thing, we're only planning on enrolling school districts that are within an existing MS4. So that usually means you're in a kind of a more urban area. If you're a school way out in a rural area, it's not likely that you're going to be put into the permit. And then we're also kind of looking at a couple different ways to try to make a floor or like a minimum size of school that would be included. We don't necessarily want to include every single very small school district that's within an MS4, and we don't want to overly burden, some of these very small schools. So on the left side, you can see some of the criteria we're considering. One thing we're thinking about is possibly only enrolling school districts that have at least one campus with greater than 1,000 students. So that means basically districts with at least one, not one school over 1,000 students. This would lead to approximately 340 school districts across the state being brought into the permit. On the right-hand side, you can see that we're thinking also about having a phase-in within that set of schools and allowing some of these smaller school districts or smaller schools to be come into compliance with the permit later. That's sort of assuming that a smaller school district would have fewer resources and less, be harder for them to implement the permit. And we're thinking that maybe as the larger schools kind of start going through the process a year or two ahead of the smaller ones, that there could be lessons learned that could help ease some of these smaller schools into the permit. We're also sort of thinking about getting some of these Southern California schools in sooner. So in the San Diego, Los Angeles, and Santa Ana regional water boards, there are more of these watershed management programs that are already kind of in place that we think it would be easier for schools to kind of get in on sooner, whether they're a larger school or a smaller school. So we're thinking that those might also get phased in sooner. And then under option number 2, that's another criteria we're thinking about. So instead of picking out school districts based on their, size of their campuses, the other way to look at it is the total enrollment within the district. And so one thing we're considering there is maybe only enrolling school districts with a total student population greater than 30,000 students. And that would only be about 30 schools across the state. These would only be the much larger school districts. But we're kind of thinking that, similar to the phase-in option I discussed before, that larger school districts not only have possibly more resources to implement the permit, but also just more schools and more land area that could potentially be affecting stormwater, and that could be, potentially used to improve stormwater.
Thank you, Paul. This is Diana. This is our facilitator. I want to just break in quickly here to make sure that I convey the message that as staff, all the detail that Paul just laid out is what we are considering. We do not know yet whether or not we're going to propose these requirements to our state water board to consider. We wanted to lay this information out and keep this an open issue that's subject to ongoing discussion. And so we know it gets pretty scary, especially right now during this COVID time period and the ongoing impacts we have throughout the state on an economic basis, that the state water board staff is now proposing all these new requirements. As you could hear from Paul, we are being extremely sensitive on the impacts, and we are looking at different options. And it's not until we further discuss these issues with the representatives from school districts and from the municipalities that we will come to a clearer decision on whether we're going to propose these requirements as staff. So I just wanted to make sure I made that note. Thank you.
Thanks, Diana. I guess one other thing I can point out on the slide is that we did also look at school acreages to try to think about whether that could be a criteria for which schools to enroll, but we really didn't have full information on school acreages for all the districts and campuses across the state. And we also think that the student population is kind of a fair way to enroll schools, because that's also how cities are enrolled in the permit based on their population size and density. So we felt like student enrollment was sort of a good proxy for that. But we're open to hearing other ideas and other criteria that anyone puts forward. And with that, I'm actually going to, that kind of finishes this school section, and I'm going to hand it off to Jaime Favila, who's going to discuss the trash provisions.
Thank you, Paul. So the last consideration for this phase 2 permit reissuance is trash. And I'll be giving you some history information on the statewide trash provisions. I want to let you know that I and my coworker, Leo Cosentino, administer the trash implementation program here at the state. And we do that under the leadership of our management team. So today I will be giving the history, the background of the statewide trash provisions, describe the land uses that these apply in, and that would be the high trash generation areas, how they apply to the NPDES permits in California for either the traditional or non-traditional phase 2 permittees. And as my colleague Kyle already mentioned, the term MS4 has a broader application. It does not solely refer to municipality-owned sewer system, but that it also includes other entities such as Department of Transportation, local sewer districts, flood control districts, hospitals, military bases, prisons, and universities. Next slide, please. So this particular workshop dedicated for the Los Angeles region is very familiar with the statewide trash provisions. that were adopted back in 2015. Because prior to the adoption of the statewide trash provisions, many efforts were already made to reduce trash from entering the state waters. As far back as 1996, thousands of volunteers were participating in the coastal cleanup days. They were finding lots of trash and debris that was ending up on the shorelines and the coast of California. And these thousands of volunteers were not only collecting the trash, but they were also documenting the types of trash that were being discharged to ocean waters. Our sister department here at the state or Environmental Protection Agency is Cal Recycle, and they keep records of the amount of trash that is collected each year from California. And I think the last count that I read was something like 77 million tons of garbage. But the interesting thing is that only 80% of that makes it to the landfills. And so there's a lot that's being discharged through our stormwater conveyances. The main types of trash that they were finding was cigarette butts, food wrappers, containers, straws, beverage containers, like aluminum cans and plastic bottles, bottle caps, plastic and paper bags. But the number one trash debris, trash particle that was being collected was something that had a diameter of 5 millimeters. And that turned out to be the cigarette and cigarette butts. So there are lots of these efforts to reduce trash in California already being made. There were two regions in our state, one being the Los Angeles Regional Water Board that adopted total maximum daily loads. There are many watersheds with numerous TMDLs in that area, but I think right now the LA Regional Board has about 15 or 16 trash TMDLs. So it's TMDL specifically dedicated to reducing trash. And they date back as far back as 2001 when the first one got adopted. The second region in the state is the San Francisco Bay Regional Board. And they had considered adoption of TMDLs at one point, but instead they crafted trash requirements in their 2009 municipal regional permit. And that's a permit that covers approximately 70 municipalities, counties, cities. So trash, we all know, harms aquatic life, but also has inverse impacts to our beneficial uses of water, like aquatic habitat, drinking water, industrial use, and even recreational. So as a result of the huge impacts to our water quality that continue to grow every year, the state water resources adopted back in April of 2015 the trash amendments, otherwise known as statewide trash provisions. And they were for the purpose of implementing a statewide trash prohibition. This was applicable to all ocean and inland surface waters, and they were to take the place of the future trash TMDLs. And they provided water board regulatory consistency and provided options for the stormwater discharges. Next slide, please. So these trash provisions were adopted in the Water Quality Control Plan for California dealing with ocean waters. And this, otherwise known as the Ocean Plan, has two appendices, Appendix D and E. One pertains to ocean waters and the other pertains to inland surface waters, enclosed bays, and estuaries. And they essentially both state the prohibition that trash should not be present in ocean waters along the shorelines or adjacent areas in amounts that adversely affect the beneficial uses or cause nuisance. And so the discharge of trash to surface waters or the deposition of trash where it may be discharged to surface waters is prohibited in the state of California. Next slide, please. So these two appendices in the ocean plan are there, and they give the prohibitions for trash, but they can only be enforced through NPDES permits, not through the water quality plans. So the NPDES stormwater permits will have a prohibition of discharge for the phase 2 and phase 1 NPDES permits, as well as the industrial and construction stormwater permits. The exception where these trash provisions will not apply are in those watersheds where TMDLs have been adopted. And those would be in the Los Angeles Regional Water Board area. Although the LA Regional Water Board has watersheds that don't have trash TMDLs, and these trash provisions would apply in those areas. The other time when these would not apply is if a regional board has exempted the discharger, a municipality, granted them a waiver for the phase 2 permit. They would not be specific. There's not a waiver specific to the trash provisions. It would have to be the entire phase 2 permit that would be applied for a waiver. And those are already defined in the phase 2 MS4 permit, the options that are given for waivers. Next slide, please. So at the time when the trash amendments, the trash provisions were adopted, the NPDES permits were not ready to incorporate these trash provisions. They usually run, or they always run through 5-year cycles and sometimes more, but they were not ready at the time to incorporate these trash provisions. And so what the state board and the regional boards did at the time in summer of 2017, they issued water quality information orders that specifically guided the dischargers to know what to do in order to initiate the planning process for compliance with these trash provisions. And so the first thing they had to do was identify the priority land use areas discharged to the storm drain system. And they were to propose the location for certified full capture systems. And then by the end of 2018, the following year, they had to submit a final jurisdictional map that proposed the location where all certified full capture systems were to be located and implemented. For track 2, they had some additional requirements. They had to do a visual trash assessment for all their priority land use areas and any alternative locations outside the priority land use areas where they were to implement a combination of trash controls that could include full capture systems, multi-benefit type trash controls, institutional controls like street sweeping, and public education. But they had to provide a rationale for how this was going to achieve full capture system equivalency, since they weren't going to be installing all full capture systems at their storm drains. Next slide, please. So the water quality informational orders require the discharger to assess their priority land uses, and they needed to select a method of compliance. The two options were the track 1 compliance option and the track 2 compliance option. Again, the track 1 required 100% of installation of full capture system devices, capturing storm drains, capturing runoff, and then the track 2, which was the installation of a combination of controls, but they had to establish equivalency to a full capture system. Next slide, please. So what are the priority land uses that apply for trash controls? These are the high density residential areas with 10 or more dwelling units per acre, industrial land uses, commercial land uses, and then the mixed urban land uses, which include the three above types of uses, and then public transportation systems. Next slide, please. So when the statewide trash provisions were adopted, they also adopted the certified full capture systems that had been certified at the regional boards. And those probably are somewhere in the neighborhood of 30 that were on a list that we developed. Then we began to certify trash devices here at the State Water Board. And we've listed them in this table 1, which includes the catch basin inserts and other devices. We have listed them in ways that would help a municipality or a prospective buyer of a trash device to know what is certified in California. So we've listed in a column that shows when the device was certified. For the grandfather devices, we listed them as a fact sheet. And it'll show whether that fact sheet has been updated. And that's an important date to keep in mind for someone that's considering the purchase of a trash device. Because we've learned that in the greater Los Angeles area, the mosquito vector control districts have informed us that there's problems with their devices. And in fact, we went and took a tour a couple of years ago, visited some of the sites where these trash controls are installed. And we did note the tremendous problem with some of these with mosquito breeding. And as we know that the local vector control districts are trying to protect public health from mosquito breedings because there are diseases that are well known in our areas. So the other type of devices that we certify are on the next slide. Next slide, please. And these are the high flow capacity trash devices in table 2. These are larger, more extensive, and what they are capable of doing with pollutants. They not only capture trash, but they can capture other pollutants. They are larger, more expensive, and take more time to install. And here again, we're noting when we've certified them, we list them under application and the date that they were certified. And some of the fact sheets that don't have dates, that means that they're up for updating that information, especially if they've had problems. We've notified them already that their grandfather devices having problems with mosquito breeding. We expect them to update their fact sheet information. And one of this certainly have to meet the design criteria for certification. They have to have a 5mm screen that captures trash particles and debris that are at least 5mm and larger. And they have to meet this the hydraulic capacity for a storm event that has for the 1 year storm event. Next slide, please. So that was my last slide, and I want to thank you, especially this Los Angeles regional area that was the vanguard, I should say, for starting the efforts to reduce trash in California. And we owe a lot to you, especially because you started the trash TMDLs, you are very familiar with trash capture devices and the requirements to reduce trash. And we want to thank you for what you're doing and continue to do. And hopefully this will encourage and inspire others to do the same. And with that, I turn it back over to Diana.
Great. Thank you, Jaime. Thank you for all that detailed information and especially for the acknowledgments. Here in California, we are leaders, and there is so much happening in Southern California and in the Los Angeles region that basically spurred that leadership and a lot of work. So our acknowledgement of all the work taking place is very important. Leo Cosentini and Jaime Favilla, they are the staff that deal one-on-one with the municipalities and the trash device manufacturers. And so they know firsthand all the work that is being done out there when it comes to controlling trash. So as we do a time check, we are at 10:11. Our scheduled break is for 10:15 until 10:30, and we will reconvene at 10:30. So we are going to just go ahead and stick to that schedule and have a few extra minutes for break time here. And we will be keeping this slide up on the screen, which once again shows the detailed instructions on how to submit questions and comments. And so we will reconvene once again at 10:30. Thank you very much. Hello again. This is Diana Messina, meeting facilitator, and our time check right now, it is 10:30. So welcome back. And at this time, we are going to start our, our staff discussions on the questions and comments that we received through email. So next slide, please. All right, so we have Kyle McNeil that is going to be reading off and facilitating this question and answer and comment period. Please, while we continue this discussion, as you have more comments and questions, please continue emailing them, and we will stay here until we get through our last emails. All right, so with that, Kyle, would you like to take it away?
Sure thing. So this is Kyle. I will be the announcer for questions and comments coming in. I'll pass them over to Paul or another staff member for a response. Please keep in mind that the questions or comments that I'm announcing, they may be paraphrased in order for brevity and efficiency. And also, if you have submitted like many questions, we may not answer all of them because we want to give an opportunity for questions to come from a diversity of people asking on a diversity of topics. Okay, so let's get to our first question, which talks about watershed management plans. A couple people asked about this. We have Daniel Apt from San Clemente, who is a consultant, and also Susanna Vargas with the LA Regional Water Quality Control Board asking about watershed management plans. So what would full participation in existing phase 1 watershed management programs look like for schools? School districts are not municipalities, therefore not all the phase 1 requirements will apply, and gaps may be created by not requiring phase 2 requirements to be implemented.
Thanks, Kyle. So, I mean, I think obviously there are other aspects to the water management programs, but I think the main thing we're trying to incentivize is getting schools to help with some of these regional stormwater capture goals that they have set for each watershed. And yes, I guess that's a good point that there could be gaps created by having certain schools meeting these phase 1 requirements instead of the phase 2 requirements. But I guess it would kind of depend on the specific situation. A lot of the reason for including the schools in the permit is to sort of have consistent coverage of requirements. So if the schools are inside of a phase 1, or if they're surrounded by a phase 1 jurisdiction, then I mean maybe it would make more sense for the school to just be kind of meeting doing similar things to the phase 1 that they're within.
Yes, and this is Diana. I will add on or build on to what Paul just mentioned. So we recognize that not only the phase 1, but also the traditional phase 2 requirements don't necessarily apply or fit quite nicely with public school districts and community colleges. And so with that, we even intend that if they are part of the phase 2 permit, they would have their own set of requirements. Now, when asking what does full participation look like, if we were to go forward with an option that Paul had shown in his staff presentation, that full participation with a phase 1 permittee would mean relief and maybe not even enrollment in the phase 2 permits, depending on what that option looks like, then full participation would look like the local agreements that will be put in place between the school district and the phase 1 entity. And with that, there would have to be the involvement of the regional board staff to make sure that all applicable requirements are in place. But most importantly, that the school ends up fulfilling the gap that is needed. And many times we see that what is needed through the schools is possibly the land or the placement of some regional facilities and so forth. So we're not necessarily looking at this as how to keep requirements consistent. We're looking at this more so on what would we need the schools to do to actually be compatible and work with the regional projects in that area. So full participation, we're basically looking to the phase ones and the existing regional efforts on what would need to be done in those gaps where the schools are.
Okay, and kind of, we have another stakeholder, Heather Miranda from the city of Santa Clarita. She is also interested in watershed plan participation with a little bit more specific questions. So will there be any standard conditions or operational outcomes for the agreements between school districts and watershed plan participants, like the level of participation or level of funding? Or will it be up to the watershed groups to determine what is included?
Yes, this is Diana again. That is definitely information we need to further discuss. If we do incorporate options for our board to consider, and one of the options, one or several of the options is for regulatory relief for schools as they participate on a regional basis, we would need to have some criteria and some thresholds on what the expectation would be for the school to have that regulatory relief. As we carve out these options further, we would want to probably have some focused stakeholder meetings with some of the phase one municipalities and with the regional board to carve that detail out. So we have not carved that detail out, but my response right now is that those options would need to have some type of criteria and thresholds for the regulatory relief.
Okay. Another question by the same person, Heather Miranda. She's curious, why is the state board requiring schools to meet local LID or local impact, low impact development requirements when there is no permitting nexus with the local government? What is the process or procedure state board expects to close the gap? Why isn't the Office of the State Architect required to incorporate the low impact development requirements into school plans for new and redevelopment? And what if local low impact development standards of the Office of State Architect standards are not in agreement?
So working with the Department of State Architect is an avenue we're still kind of looking into. We've had a few preliminary meetings with them, and they seemed pretty adamant that they only review things based on the state building code, and we're still trying to, I feel like, learn each other's language a little bit. They weren't sure exactly how they would be enforcing a stormwater permit unless it was something written into the statewide building code.
Okay. Similarly, on the line of post-construction requirements, Susanna Vargas from the LA Regional Water Board also had this question. For school post-construction requirements, what incentives do municipalities have to review plans that are outside of their jurisdictional control and cannot provide that official approval for? This potential requirement would lead to additional workload for the cities without a way to levy fees and possibly create liability issues which they may not be willing to accept.
Okay, this is really closely related to the last question, and yeah, still comes down to what we're trying to figure out of whether the state architect will incorporate a review of these features, or whether if the state architect's not going to review for stormwater features, if there's going to be some kind of local review or kind of like comment period by a city to look at these potential building plans for schools. And Suzanne is pointing out that basically when a city is reviewing stormwater aspects of a new building, they're paying for that from money that they got from the building permit application. But if a school isn't really technically getting a building permit from the city, they're just submitting it to the city to comment on, since the city doesn't actually have final review authority, then the city wouldn't really be getting any building permit fees to review that, and so it would just be a burden on the city to look at these school stormwater plans or stormwater control building plans. And that was one, I guess, thing that we were just thinking about, if somehow the working with the state architect didn't work out. That was one option that I guess we were curious what cities thought about that, because some municipalities I've talked to seem like they really just want to know what's going on. There's schools that are, doing new buildings or projects on their property that sometimes, affect the hydrology of the city. There's extra runoff coming from the school onto city streets, and cities aren't really the city isn't really part of that, and they don't really know what's going on there. So I didn't know if that was one option that cities, I don't know, that might help cities know more what's going on as schools are being worked on.
Thanks, Paul. Our next question is from Daniel Apt, who is a consultant in San Clemente. And he's asking, will schools be subject to total maximum daily loads, or TMDLs, and when will this occur?
I think some schools will be. It kind of might depend on the TMDL and the way it's written. And so, yes, it's possible that schools will be subject to TMDLs. That would occur, I guess, as the permit becomes effective, because most of these would probably be TMDLs that are already in place.
Yes, and this is Diana. The implementation of TMDLs and municipal stormwater permits is quite unique. As a total maximum daily load are the specific waste load allocations that go that are applied to a stretch of a water body. Yet when this regulation from the regional board's basin plan for the TMDLs goes into place, many times the intent behind the TMDL is to regulate the stormwater discharges within the watershed that drains to that stretch of water body. So with each TMDL, we look at the pollutants that are impairing that stretch of water body. And if that is a pollutant that we would see coming from a school. So in general, we would state that if a school or a community college does become phase 2 permittee, and a TMDL does name urban stormwater or a municipal stormwater permittee as a party to that TMDL, then yes, they would be party to that TMDL through the permit. However, when you look into more detail of the pollutants, of the TMDLs, of the intent, and so forth, that would most probably carve out the amount of participation that would be expected from a school district or a community college. Now it gets really difficult if we regulate the public school districts and community colleges separately, and they are not part of a municipal program with the adjacent municipalities, because then it's just there's so much of a disconnect when it comes to overall watershed efforts to reduce that subject pollutants that's causing the downstream impairments. So that's definitely an application that is much more easier if the school's participating with a regional project that is directly addressing the TMDL pollutants, and much harder if schools and community colleges end up being their own, simply they're separate permittees that are acting on their own and complying with the permit on their own.
So we have an update from Heather Miranda, who we heard her question earlier on the Office of the State Architect. So she's mentions that there is a green code section of the California Building Code that does include stormwater treatment that state board staff may want to review in discussion with the Office of the State Architect. So thank you, Heather, for letting us know about that. If you can email us that specific section, that would be very helpful. And then
wait, this is Paul. I'll also say that we've looked at that section a little bit, and the state architect did kind of bring that up, but I thought they were also explaining to me that they don't actually review things from the green building code. It's almost like a voluntary checkbox that they put on their review. So I guess that's something we'll just have to look more into, but thanks for pointing that out. And I'm also not sure if that section of the building code covers the full, same kind of full breadth that the requirements we have in the phase 2 permit do. And there's also a couple other complicating factors that I think the different state agencies that review building plans, there's others besides the state architect, they only adopt certain parts of the building code, as I understand. So even if it's in the building code, then the state architect would also have to adopt it. So basically, I guess we need to maybe inform the state board, architect a little more about our process, and we also need to be more informed a little bit about their process to try and figure this out. But thanks for pointing that out.
Yes, and this is Diana. I guess my further contribution here maybe is not directly related to that question, but I do want to state it prior to me forgetting, and it is related to this overall discussion. Our State Water Board Division of Financial Assistance has previously had financial assistance programs, a grant program for schools. And there were some criteria for that grant funding. I'm not good with acronyms, but I think it was called drops or something. So anyway, so we do have some information that has come back from that grant program on successful LID, low impact development and post-construction features that have been placed in schools. And so we would also be going back to that and looking at what has successfully been implemented in schools and what process they took there in order to get the appropriate approvals.
So we have two people who emailed in with a similar question. Cameron McCullough from representing John L. Hunter and Associates, and Sam Ho, who is a consultant for Pavement Engineering Incorporated. And so they were both wondering if the presentation slides shown today will be available for download. And I can answer this. Yes, they will be available later on. The State Water Board staff, we will be emailing each of you PowerPoint slides in a few days. And so you will have that to review. And then also mentioned earlier in the presentation is that we have recorded these workshops, and we will be posting a recording of them once we have that, and we will email to let you know. So you'll definitely be able to access and view this content at a later point in time.
Kyle, this is Diana. Does that include everyone that registered for the workshop, or only people that are emailing questions?
It will include everyone who registered.
Wonderful, thank you.
Is that also something we could notice on our LIRIS list for anyone that's on the stormwater LIRIS list in case they didn't register?
Yes, we can definitely do that. And that is a good idea to do that in case they didn't realize what these workshops were about. Okay, so we have another question from Heather Miranda, representing the city of Santa Clarita in Los Angeles County. And her question is about integrated pest management versus mosquito vector control. So it is, how will integrated pest management requirements versus mosquito vector control requirements be addressed? What will the prioritization look like for actions related to stormwater treatment versus vector control?
That's a good question and a kind of intersection that I hadn't really thought about. I know that the vector control comes up a lot with the trash devices, so I'm not sure if Jaime wants to weigh in on this at all. As far as these new integrated pest management requirements we're talking about, I'd have to look into this a little more. I'm not really sure how these two would mesh.
This is Jaime. With regard to the trash implementation requirements, we have certification requirements that has to do with vector control accessibility. So the design of the device, in order to be certified, has to achieve what not only the local vector control agency requires, but it's actually the Mosquito Vector Control Association of California that has a review team for the 5 regions in California that pertain to the local vector control districts. And each one of them is given input on what they expect for accessibility into that particular best management practice. The device has to be able to easily be accessible for inspection. And if treatment is needed, they need to be able to use their implements for using briquettes or sprays, whatever type of treatment they use. So they're looking at these aspects of the design of the device.
Yes, and this is Diana. I'd like to build on that a little further. Thank you, Jaime. So our state and regional water boards, we uphold highest priority when it comes to public health protection. And the vector and mosquito control agencies, they work under our statewide permit for vector control. And these agencies have their specific best management practices that they use with their application of their pesticides. And with that, our boards acknowledge that there may be some toxicity coming from the vector and mosquito control pesticides, yet with the best management practices they implement, that is minimized and necessary in order to protect public health. So with the overall question on that, we do prioritize vector and mosquito control above other integrated pest management. And for other purposes for the integrated pest management, as Paul had mentioned in the staff presentation, that we do look to the agencies to make sure they identify that as the last resort. Our vector and mosquito control agencies, Jaime meets with them on a regular basis, and they are extremely active on working with the device manufacturers on how manufacturers can modify the devices that are offered in California to minimize breeding within those devices. So the vector and mosquito control agencies are also trying to work so that their treatments are minimized in the last resort, especially if they can find ways to get those device designs changed. And if not to minimize breeding, at least for the agencies to have better access into those devices so they can conduct more localized pesticide application instead of having to do larger areas because they don't have access into those trash devices.
Returning to previous questions and comments about the department, the Office of the State Architect, we have a comment from Daniel Apt, who is a consultant for Ovanu, and this is a clarification to some. He says that DSA, or the Office of the State Architect's Los Angeles office, is reviewing stormwater projects for some schools in the Los Angeles area.
Oh, that's good to know. We'll have to look into that a little more. Thanks, Daniel.
Okay, so that is the questions and comments we have received so far. That if anyone else has a question that they'd like answered, now is the time. And if you have any comments on maybe things that are going on locally for you that is working or you're finding isn't working, the State Water Board would like to know. I'll open this up time for our speakers if they want to reiterate any points that they feel warrant some greater expansion.
Yes, thank you, Kyle. This is Diana. We will give that opportunity to Paul and to Jaime and any other staff as necessary. But before we do, I just want to announce that as staff, we will stay on and keep this meeting open an extra 20 minutes above and beyond the time that we're not receiving any questions or comments, because we want to make sure we're available if for any reason something more pops up that you would like to ask. So Paul and Jaime, I intend to go through the permit development process in a little bit more detail, but before that, is there more information you'd like to add?
This is Paul. I don't think I have any more information I want to add at this time.
And this is Jaime. Just to let you know that there has been quite a bit of work that Paul and people in the subcommittee that are crafting the requirements for the phase 2 permit. As far as trash requirements, we have not begun that process to that extent. So when we get those developed, we will certainly reach out to the stakeholders at the appropriate time for their comments.
Jaime, this is Diana. Well, we have you here. Can you explain to the audience the extra detail you place in the certification log, which we have online for devices that have been reviewed by the vector and mosquito control agencies?
Okay, if we could go back a couple of slides. So again, that's it. Thank you. So these tables from the list of trash treatment control devices will show the manufacturer, the owner of the device who has applied for certification. And they've got information on their website. So we listed the their URL for their company website. And you can find much of this information on their webpage. We identify the name of the device. Sometimes it changes names depending on who owns the device. That's happened before. And we also, again, the third column shows if we have certified the device, we call it an application. As you can see on this first page, application 2 was certified on March 15th of 2018. And at that time, we had not begun the process of working with the Vector Control Association of California, the Mosquito Vector Control Association of California. So now that it's become an apparent problem for public health and we know the cause of some of the problem out there with mosquito breeding, it has to do with the trash devices. We now want to make sure that they have been undergone the review of the Mosquito Vector Control Association. And when that happens, when they give approval, they actually give a verification letter of approval. I will list that date on the last column there on the right. So on this first page, let's see. Actually, there are some that have been updated. We just haven't completed the web request that will authorize us to post the most current certification list. And let's see, like for BioClean Environmental Services, BC4 is no longer something that is being produced. So we've taken that off the list. And BC3, which is a couple of rows down, also by BioClean, that has received their letter of verification from the Mosquito Vector Control Association, and they have updated their fact sheets so that it aligns and is consistent with the requirements that we have here at the State Water Board for certification of trash devices. So I don't know if there's anything else in particular that you wanted me to cover, Diana?
No, that was very good. As I just wanted to make sure that folks note that there is information on our website regarding the vector control accessibility verification. All right. So as we look back at the questions that were submitted, we do see that there are questions that at first we thought we had covered them in the presentation, but because we have this time, we'd like to go through and respond to these questions. So Kyle, do you want to take that away?
Yes. So these questions are pertaining to schools mostly. So from Daniel Abt, consultant of Olanu, his question is the State Water Board going to identify funding resources for schools?
All right, this is Diana. I can address that. So the funding resources that comes in through schools, or all the funding resources, let me back up a little bit. All the funding resources that the State Water Board provides is administered through the State Water Board's Division of Financial Assistance. The assistance that we have seen in the past come forth through schools are grants. And so grants are provided when we have propositions that pass for funding, and there's in those propositions and in the legislation, it states that what the purpose of that funding is. So we are not the experts. I am not the experts on what's currently going on in the Division of Financial Assistance. We would have to check. I think probably what's best right now, our Division of Financial Assistance staff are very good when it comes to updating their website on how many funds have been administered out to grant projects and which projects those are, and what they foresee when it comes to funding in the future, and also what funding may be available right now, and when they will start accepting grant applications and so forth. So, so our recommendation is to go on the State Water Board Division of Financial Assistance website and see what the status is. And we will also be working with that division, because we do understand that when we ask our State Water Board to consider requirements in permits, that we do need to take in account if there will be some funding assistance with that. So thank you very much for that question. Paul, did you have anything you wanted to add for that?
No, I don't think so. It did make me sort of wonder, though, what kind of the order those things usually go in. Like, do the bonds, if there is some kind of bond or grant, does that usually follow the rule being passed, like in response to new requirements, like for schools, for example, or do those sometimes come at the same time? I guess I'm not that sure about that.
Typically, it depends on legislation and trailer bills that come forth. And so at this time, I believe the Division of Financial Assistance does have a program that helps fund schools. I'm not sure if that was a one-time program or an ongoing program. So unfortunately, we didn't think ahead to have a Division of Financial Assistance staff on this meeting team. And I believe it was called the DROPS program. So if you do go on the website, if you look into that, we will also do that, Daniel, and find the website information and email you the links just to provide you with some specific direction there.
Our next question is the cost of compliance project being developed by the State Water Board storms considering schools?
Yes, this is Diana. And actually it's Mary Boyd, our program manager here. She is very involved with that effort for the cost of compliance. What this commenter is referring to is an initiative that has taken place within our state and regional water boards and with stormwater permittees on identifying the cost of compliance, and more so when it comes to us regulatory staff to place requirements in permits for the permittees to actually identify and keep track of the cost of work that they have already performed to manage stormwater, as well as additional work that is being proposed in permits, as well as is finally adopted in permits. When we refer to storms is a special unit of staff that the State Water Board has that looks at regulatory issues before they go in permits. And so there's the effort right now in which that all that work is being done when it comes to cost. And as we continue considering schools and potentially being regulated, that would definitely need to be part of the investigative work that's being done for stormwater regulatory costs. So that is a long way of saying yes. And that effort is not only is not only led by State Water Board staff, it's also led by a lot of consultants and agencies, and we have a large regional board participation effort also. So cost when it comes to stormwater management has come to the forefront, and we will be using that process to assist us in considering regulating schools.
We have a few more questions on schools. Will there be retrofit requirements in the permit? And if so, for what type of permittees? Traditional, non-traditional schools, etc.
So, I'm sorry, Kyle, can you repeat the question?
Sorry, yes. Will there be retrofit requirements in the permit? And if so, for what type of permittees?
So we're not planning on putting any retrofit requirements. However, we are considering some retrofit incentives, which I pointed out on one of my previous slides. It was one of the options of school incentives. They put some stormwater capture to capture the stormwater from their own property, then that could lead to reduced fees and decreased control measures.
Okay, and a second question, will the public education component for schools require changes to school curriculum?
So I did try to touch on this in my presentation, and we're not planning on requiring changes to curriculum. Although if there is a way to, work out some kind of program where you can get these stormwater messages more directly in front of the students, or have some kind of, interactive type thing going on with the students, I mean, that definitely does seem like a more effective way to get this stormwater, knowledge out there. There's one really cool program that I just heard about recently in Lodi, where students get extra credit for going on an after school hours trip and doing some water sampling with the city, and then they do kind of an end of the year report where they talk about all the data that they collected, and they're like out there in the field actually seeing what the effects of stormwater are, and it's pretty cool. So we can't require everyone to do something like that, but those kind of things are, we would like to promote stuff like that, I guess.
So I'd like to take a moment to thank Heather Miranda. Heather emailed in some attachments, and we very much appreciate them. Thank you, Heather, for providing these for the State Water Board staff to look at. And then, so we have our last question that I think has been emailed in from Daniel Apt. Will schools be subject to similar post-construction requirements as the current traditional and non-traditional permittees post-construction requirements?
So I think the idea is that if they kind of coordinate on some of these regional capture projects, then maybe that would make those unnecessary. But if the school is kind of working by themselves, then yes, they would probably have some kind of post-construction requirements similar to current traditionals and non-traditionals.
Okay, so that is it for the questions and comments I'm seeing that we've received so far.
Okay, very good. This is Diana. Then how about next slide, please? Thank you. So now I'm going to take the time to go over in a little bit more detail what's to come ahead of us all. So As we announced, these are our preliminary stakeholder workshops. Our state water board members and executive managers, they hold a very high expectation when it comes to staff developing permits in a transparent manner and working very closely with stakeholders in the most efficient way possible. So this is the third out of 4 workshops. We'll have our 4th workshop this afternoon. It'll be a similar workshop, and this one again will be focused on Southern California as a whole. After these workshops, Mary Boyd and her staff will continue drafting the permit and will continue working closely with the major stakeholder entities. We work closely with the California Association of, California Stormwater Quality Association, CASQA, continue working closely with CASH, and continue just working closely with other interested parties that step forth, including environmental groups. We have found that it's most efficient as we have these issues to go forward and have what we call focused stakeholder meetings, which means meeting one-on-one with the different interests, or at times pulling in multiple interests, representatives from multiple interests in the same room. So we can have a full discussion, and actually it's not just us talking to you, it's all of you talking to each other. To understand just basically the shoes that and the goals that the environmental groups would be looking for, that the schools are needing, and their concerns, and the input from the municipalities. So what I'm saying is we'll be having further focused stakeholder outreach as our staff continues developing the draft permit. Once we have a draft permit developed, our state water board office, we will issue the draft permit for a public comment period. So this is a formal draft. Typically, the minimum number of days for a draft statewide permit is 45 days when it comes to a public comment period. Sometimes we'll put it out for longer, depending on the requests or other concurrent demands going on with our stakeholders. So during the time period that we have a public comment draft permit out, it's during the public comment period that we request our state water board to hold a public hearing. Because at that time, the draft permit is out, and as stakeholders and as interested parties, we provide you the opportunity to actually speak directly to our board members during a public hearing. So during that public hearing, staff may give a brief staff presentation just to lay down a summary of the draft permit, and the rest of the time really is for parties to speak directly to our board. Our state water board is continuing conducting their meetings online. They've been very successful, and so that has been uninterrupted. Hopefully we will be getting over this pandemic hump and possibly meeting in person, but regardless on whether it's a virtual board meeting or an in-person board meeting, that is the time period that we have our first public hearing. So then the public comment period comes to a close, and we have a lot of work ahead of us then, because as staff, we read through all the public comments, we categorize them, and we consider them all. We make sure that the public comments are accessible to the public and the state water board members. We have our discussions, we have further meetings with commenters as necessary to understand the issues behind the comments, and then we revise yet another final draft permit. And this final draft permit, the differences between this final draft and the final draft that went out for public comments are changes that are based on the public comments submitted. So the message I'm getting across right now is that our draft permit is not set in stone. And there are a lot of changes that can potentially take place to the draft permit based on public comments. So your public comments are extremely important. So then with that final draft permit, we ask our clerk to schedule a State Water Board meeting for our board members to consider adoption of that draft. During that adoption meeting, once again, our board opens a hearing in order to consider the adoption of that draft permit. And it is not until the board votes and adopts that permit in which then we have an adopted permit. And for those of you that have experienced State Water Board meetings, you know that even during an adoption hearing, there are still changes that could be taking place to that permit before the board wants to consider adopting it. So then, next slide, please. Thank you. When the State Water Board does adopt a permit, that permit will have an effective date built into it. The effective date is the date that the requirements become effective. They don't become effective immediately on the day the permit is adopted. That effective date is a date that we definitely have discussions with our permittees or with our proposed permittees to make sure that the timing the proposed permit goes in effect not only is a good time of year. We don't want to hit you up in the middle of winter when we would rather have you managing your stormwater, but we also take in account how much time between the adoption of the permit and the effectiveness of the requirements do the permittees need to get ready to be in compliance. As Paul explained in his staff presentation, we are taking the effective dates even further when it comes to our consideration of enrolling schools. And so we would have potentially multiple effective dates for multiple portions of the permits, especially if our board does make the decision to start regulating schools. We would want to give them the time necessary to start working, to start doing the work they need to do. When it comes to transitioning existing enrollees into a new permit, we keep that minimal. We do not typically require existing enrollees in an existing permit to reapply for a new reissued permit. We try to make that transition as seamless as possible. The adopted permit would have the application procedures or all the other procedures that any newly required enrollees would have to go through in order to become a regulated permittee under the proposed permits. So with that, I think I saw a couple flashes with more emails coming in. Kyle, do we have more questions?
This is Paul. We did get one email from someone in the stormwater planning section here at the State Water Board that wanted to point out that they did release a couple of years ago a guidance document for schools that kind of explained how some of these regional coordination, regional partnerships might work. It's called Guidance for Stormwater and Dry Weather Runoff Capture at Schools. It's available on our website. Not sure the best way to share that with the audience, but it kind of describes in more detail, some of the stuff we talked about in the presentation a little bit.
I see. How about this, Paul and Mary? How about if we include that link in our email that we're sending to all meeting, all participants that registered for this meeting, because that basically does answer a lot of the questions we have received not only in this workshop, but in other workshops. So we would be making it a little easier for everyone to access that.
Sure, we can do that, Diana.
Okay, very good. And thank you to our planning staff that's provided that information to us. All right, next slide, please. So now I just want to take the time to thank all our participants and joining in on this meeting. We appreciate not only everyone that has submitted comments and questions, but all of you behind the scenes that have been listening, have been taking this information in, and also all of you that have been working very closely with our staff already to get as far as we have with this proposed permit. As I mentioned, we are going to keep this meeting open for another 20 minutes in case there's more comments, so forth. So it is 11:26 right now. We'll keep this meeting open until 11:45. But if we do not reconvene for any further questions or comments, on behalf of State Water Board staff, we want to thank you very much for participating in our workshop. So with that, we are going to just hang out behind the scenes here and continue monitoring our email. And if anything comes up, we'll pop back in. Thank you.
Hello. Hi, everyone. This is Kyle. We have received a comment from Richard Watson, representing Richard Watson and Associates Incorporated. And his comment is, toward the end of the workshop, you mentioned that you were working closely with CASH. As I recall, prior to readoption of the permit in 2013, State Water Board staff had proposed inclusion of schools. And I believe that CASH convinced the governor that schools should not be included at that time. And the governor spoke to state board members. Do you think that could happen again? The phase 1 municipalities with which I work in LA County really want schools to be permitted. Being permitted should promote greater cooperation with municipalities and watersheds.
So, yes, this is Diana Messina. Thank you, Richard, for your comments and your questions. This group of staff was not around back at that time when the phase 2 permit was adopted. However, I do recall listening to the hearings during the development of that permit from the office I used to work in, and there was a tremendous amount of discussion. And a lot of schools and school representatives did step forward with their concerns. I do believe that we may be in that same situation again, especially now with COVID and the economic turn. Back in 2012, there was the concern on the economic hardships at that time. And ironically, in this last 3 months, we see ourselves in somewhat of a similar position. So as staff, we would not be surprised whatsoever if school representatives do step forward and talk to much higher level government officials. With that, however, your second part of your comments is exactly why we are once again proposing, or at least considering, schools. As phase 1 agencies, have been doing so much work, and some of them have been finding that the holes in this, we think of it as Swiss cheese, the holes that kind of are left throughout, especially very dense, highly populated urban landscapes, and where schools are located, that that property can be put to very good use if there was a strong partnership with the school districts. So to answer your question, yes and yes. And I hope we addressed everything in your comments. Kyle, did we address his entire comment there?
Yes. Yes, we did.
This is Paul. I guess I just have like a little bit that I can add to that, having, being working with CASH. And we all know that this is a very still evolving situation and still waiting to figure out how this, all the pandemic effects are going to kind of shake out. But as far as I know, and so far, CASH has still expressed pretty, a high level of optimism of keeping this moving forward. And they feel like we've built up a good amount of momentum. And, we've been trying to do more outreach, as we pointed out earlier in our presentation. Since 2018, we've been having some meetings with schools to try and, get them on board. So I guess I wasn't there in 2013, but I've been told that it seems like we are, besides the economic situation, in some ways we kind of have, as Cash has pointed out, momentum to keep using to possibly bring schools in this time.
Thank you, Paul. And this is Diane again. I think with this input and this discussion, it's getting ripe to have a focused stakeholder meeting, to have some municipality representatives and CASH representatives in the same room. And so we understand just the current status of everyone's position.
Hi, Diana. This is Mary Boyd. I think that's a great idea, and we'll work on organizing that. It might be a few months out so that we could get more details to them, but I think that's a great idea.
So currently we have not received any other comments or questions, but we do have about a minute left. So we'll stick around for another minute and see if something comes last second.
Very good, thank you. So this is Diana Messina. Once again, on behalf of State Water Board, we want to thank you all for participating. And it's 11:45. We have not been receiving any more questions. And so at this time, we're going to say goodbye. Thank you and have a good day.